A Bit Lit, celebrating research and creativity of all kinds.
Tom, how are you doing?
I'm very well, Andy. It's so good to see you again. It's been a couple of months since we've Zoomed and a couple of years since we've met in public, and that is just semi-tragic, borderline tragedy there.
Yeah, 100% tragic as far as I'm concerned. It's not tragicomic, it's squarely tragic.
It's yes, right in there.
Yeah. Well, these are the times that we're living in, and you and I have been having the best fun we can under those circumstances by making online conversations. And I'm really delighted to have you join us for A Bit Lit. We start by getting contributors to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about their work. So would you mind doing that, please?
Okay, yes. This is a flip from what I normally do. And yes, I'm Thomas Dabbs. I teach at Aoyama Gakuin University, or AGU, in central Tokyo. And I've taught here since 2003. And I teach Shakespeare and the English Bible, the Bible in English, to students. We are a Methodist university, but not extraordinarily. There are not a lot of Christians on campus. There's a need for general instruction in biblical stories and so forth to help students with understanding Western culture and so forth. And Shakespeare sort of speaks for itself. Shakespeare is very popular in Japan. I'm an American and from the American South originally, and I landed over here in 1994 because there was a great job offer, and I knew absolutely no Japanese at that time. And I have some great stories that I could regale you with in another venue. Went back to the States for a period and then came straight back, just hightailed it straight back here when another job opened up. And this has just been a delightful tenure here for the past almost 20 years.
Brilliant, thank you. And very generously there, you focused on your teaching career. Would you mind telling us a little bit about both your recent online activity and about your research?
Okay, well, I'll start
as a kind of introduction to those two parts of your work.
Okay, I will start with the online activity because I'm extremely excited about this. This has been something very happy during a kind of sad time. And what happened was that I went on sabbatical in 2019 and I got back. Our term is kind of odd. We start the year in April. So as you remember, in March of 2020 is when everything hit. And also what hit was that I was awarded a grant, and the grant was, I made a promise to the Japanese people. This is a very major government grant. I made a promise that I would invite speakers in for symposia on various topics. And I won't bore your audience too much, but I wanted to talk about digital humanities and of course, things having to do with Shakespeare, but not just Shakespeare. And I had a kind of list of people, I had a list of people that I wanted to ask. I had ideas about what kind of venue we would use, that sort of thing. And the grant came in, and then suddenly we're in a situation where we can't bring anybody in. And I have all this money that I can't spend. So at that time, I had absolutely no idea what Zoom was, how to do any of this stuff. And also, I was going to have to teach classes on Zoom. And so, like you, we all had this crash course in digital technology and also broadcast technology. I've never broadcast in my life. And I thought, well, you know what we can do if I can get some people to agree. And I started off with friends like you and others. I think Ben Crystal, Sarah Olive, and other people who had Japan experience and whom I knew and would be willing to come on and help sort of kickstart this. And started doing podcast and long form podcast to put out on YouTube, and it has worked just splendidly well. Now, we don't get quite the reception of what puppy videos. We're not big time YouTube, but a few hundred views, that would be a major plenary session for any of the people I've invited on. And so over the year, a little bit over a year that we've been doing this, I recently spoke with James Shapiro of Columbia and some British scholars, Tiffany Stern, Emma Smith, whom you have collaborated with, and Sonia Masai, and some more coming up. I'm not sure if I can name who exactly. We have to wait to see who responds because a lot of people are very busy right now. And others that I'm not mentioning and I should mention, but we've done 28, 29, I have to check, of these so far. The series is called Speaking of Shakespeare, and it's just that. Now, A Bit Lit is much broader based, and I think that probably is the better idea, but I stay focused on Shakespeare because I am not very confident about my knowledge outside of my narrow area. And I talk to these Shakespeareans, and sometimes they get outside of my comfort zone, but everybody we've had on has been very gracious and very, very good about explaining themselves, and we've been able to have conversations rather than just straight presentations. You did a presentation for our undergraduates and my colleagues, and I put those up too. We have 4 or 5 straight up presentations, but most of these are just conversations, like you said, with A Bit Lit, like the kind of conversation you have at the pub, or when you meet on the streets or meet in the hallway with your academic colleagues that we have missed so much in this period. But again, Speaking of Shakespeare, it's on YouTube, and it's on a large variety of podcasts, and you just use the search term Speaking of Shakespeare if you're interested in some of that. And after that small, you can see why I'm not hired to do advertisements for television. I don't get to the 30-second rule. I just break that. But
it's a brilliant advert. It's a brilliant advert for a really brilliant series. And perhaps we should stop and dwell on this series for a bit longer before we move on to thinking about research. And you've had such a wealth of speakers, Tom, and you're such a genial host and so skilled at that really strange, difficult art of having a conversation which is specialized, but at the same time open to new audiences. And I think it does feel like digital publication is excitingly enabling those sorts of conversations, but they're hard to host, and you do so brilliantly. And I love the fact that you're comparing yourselves to puppy videos. And if you're looking for future speakers, but you don't want people to stray out of the topic of Shakespeare, maybe you should interview some puppies, some very cute puppies, because they've got nothing to say about non-Shakespearean topics, I believe.
Well, I just did Holger's Syme. He's not up yet. And Holger, you know Holger well, and he's just so jovial and so fun. And he had a dog coming in and out, and Emma Smith had her dog, and we are officially chartered in our non-charter pro dog podcast. And I think in future podcasts, I'm saying, listen, bring the dog in too. So that might bring in a couple of more people, but really we're 4 people who are interested in Shakespeare and things Shakespearean. I think the great purpose here is to show the broader community of not just academic Shakespeareans, but people who are teaching Shakespeare at every level. A lot of people have come on who are just interested in Shakespeare. And so we try to vary things a bit. I'll talk to hardline textual editorial scholars. I'll talk to people who are in theater, like Holger, who is interested in theater history. I've talked with Ben, the actor, and we've talked about the development of digital tools, that the Internet Shakespeare online. Brett Greatly Hirsch, who does the digital Renaissance editions, and David McGinnis, who does the Lost Plays database. So we do some of those things. Sometimes we get into the weeds. They're long, but I've segmented them, I hope, where you can skip over sections that might not be that interesting and go to other sections that may be interesting to you. Mm-hmm. But I think the value of this kind of thing not being a polished publication that's been peer review, edited, and so forth, is you get to know the scholar, because we very often just know these people by name, maybe one photograph on their webpage, and we don't get to know them. And also, this forms, I think, an archive. It is something we'll maybe be able to look back on and say, here we were at this time doing these things. And so there's a long shelf life for it. And that thrills me.
Yeah, that's great. We had Holger Simon on for a bit lit. A year and a half ago now, and it was like witnessing an animal baiting. It did feel like he was being slowly killed by his dog as this conversation continues. So I look forward to seeing the sequel on your channel coming up soon. And I love that idea, Tom, of creating an archive. It does feel like these are, in some sense, a kind of time capsule of where scholars and scholarship and practitioners are at a time of well, I was going to say unprecedented medical emergency, but I'm not sure it is unprecedented, but certainly unprecedented in our lifetime. Yes, I'm also, you talk about segmenting your films so people can skip through to the parts they're interested in. But one of the things I love about the format you're pursuing, and I think it's probably true of us as well, is that we so rarely hear, when we hear from scholars, it tends to be kind of itemized and atomized around the particular research interest of a seminar paper or of a book. But when you are able to have a conversation which is much more informal, it allows us to range much more broadly across their scholarly interests and to see the research not via the biography of the person doing it, although that can be incorporated too if we want it to, but just the intellectual scope of the person doing it. And I've really loved that about conversations that you're having.
Yeah, well, you do this too. And the spontaneity is nice. And sometimes what seems to be a rabbit trail at the beginning, it turns out to be something extremely interesting when you go back and look over it. And so I try to, some of our guests are more comfortable with a kind of agenda. They ask me for an agenda and I give them an agenda and kind of follow it. And others are just ready to come on and talk. And of course, anyone who's had a recent book or a couple of recent articles, we start there and just see where we go from there and try to get the whole person in there. So in the future, I'm going to, beginning in April of this year, I'm going to try to focus a little bit more on religion and the Bible and the great reformations of the 16th century and those the relationship with Shakespeare, and also, as you know, in your area, we get a little bit. We've pushed in our careers to try to get people to go outside of just Shakespeare and to see this burst of energy in the theater and dramatic arts in the 16th century as a much, much wider movement than just Shakespeare.
Yeah, wonderful. I look forward to that, and I should imagine that this film will be going live on our website about that time. So hopefully we can use this film to drive some traffic as religion comes to the fore. And I think probably towards the end of the conversation, Tom, I'd like to return to the fact that you've been teaching Shakespeare and the English Bible in Japan, and maybe unpack that. But if it's all right, we'll hold that thought for now. But just give you a heads up. I'd love to head there. But I'm so interested in what you just said about the spontaneity of these digital forms of scholarly communication, because I suspect if you asked a scholar to speak spontaneously for an hour in any other circumstances, most of them would be filled with panic. And spontaneity is generally not what we do, at least when we're engaging as researchers. And there's something happening here in the form of the conversation, in the technology, in its digital reach, and with COVID, which is kind of jumbling all together to refashion how scholars think about talking about research in time, talking about research spontaneously rather than from a carefully wrought script.
Yeah, not all scholars, and there's some. I've asked people who have sort of put me off. They're too busy, and I think the subtext there is that they're maybe not comfortable. There are a lot of people who are just shy about this sort of thing, not being prepared, and I fully understand that. As you and I both know, actors are very often very shy people, and so I want to do more actors, but I think sometimes they just would rather have their performance that they prepared and so forth. And also scholars can be a bit like that. And then I have other people who are very accustomed to public speaking. And I think most of us are from our teaching, all of us at some point have had to walk into a classroom not as prepared as we wanted to be and just wing it. And we have to develop that talent. So we get used to it. But I think for probably the majority of us really, really do. I feel so good after these conversations. I feel like I've made a new friend and I have someone, without being able to bring them in and take them out to eat or whatnot, that at least we've done that. And so it's a very unifying thing. And I'm hoping the people who listen in like that. And I should say myself that I knew at the age of 8 years old when I played, I had to be Little Boy Blue in a school play, and I had to blow the trumpet. I knew how to play trumpet a little bit. And I got on stage and I saw my mother out there and a couple of uncles or whatnot, and I froze. I froze. I just knew at that moment that I will never get over stage fright. And yet in teaching, I don't feel any anxiety whatsoever. And I also grew up as I say on almost every podcast, in the country. I don't want to age myself too much, but we did not have a zillion television channels, and certainly not the internet or anything like that. The way you pass time is you had conversations on the porch. And I learned that from my parents, and I learned it from myself doing the same thing. And it fits just very naturally in with it. I didn't know that I was going to some kind of school, but I've noticed that a lot of people who are maybe my age and maybe younger aren't very well equipped for that. But a lot of us are. And this profession and in literature and so forth seems to draw us out, the people who like the front porch conversation. And so it seems mostly natural to people.
I love the idea of front porch conversation. And I'm really struck by what you say about how all scholars are spontaneous when we teach. And it's kind of fascinating to me that usually when we teach, we're often ranging much more widely and broadly than we are in our research in terms of texts, periods, even disciplines that we might teach. And it's kind of fascinating that the more expert we become, the less spontaneous we have traditionally been. And I'm really interested in the form that you and I are pursuing as to whether that might help to change some of that a little bit and introduce essentially rhetorical improvisation into some of the ways in which we communicate professionally.
Yeah, I don't know if you've had this experience, but it's almost invariable. More and more over my career, we've been asked by the people in charge of this sort of thing to structure our classes more and more. And I think that is good to a degree, because I started out where you just are here, go on in and teach the class. And I wanted more guidance. And we're in a situation now in Japan, the Ministry of Education wants this very defined syllabus well ahead of the next semester. And every year, and we're at the time of year when I think about this, almost invariably, I come up with an idea that I'll say, this is going to work great. This is going to, and I'll just start out and lead with this. And almost invariably, it fails. I miss that gap between what I think will work in my mind and what actually works in class. And then you get in there and maybe you're trying to wing it and something happens and clicks you. Oh, that works, right? Mm-hmm. When you're in front of the students, you go, okay, so I can move it in that direction. And I just love the fact that what we teach gives us that flexibility to move around like that. And of course, most of my students, they'll follow me. If we get off syllabus, they're not a bit. they don't get too upset about that, and not upset at all, really.
No, it's fascinating. Yeah, yes. Structure and teaching is institutionally enforced structure and teaching is often an issue. So yeah, again, joy to think about this form where we can be much more spontaneous. I'm keen to move towards thinking about your research, Tom, and I wonder if a kind of segue question is whether running the seminar series style conversations that you've been running, I don't know if that's the right word, but running Speaking of Shakespeare, has that in any way, do you think, affected you as a researcher? Have you been learning things that you might take forward? Have you been finding yourself in new kinds of conversations, or sometimes by dint of the fact that we're inviting people that we know already, actually all we do is confirm things we're already interested in? I just wondered if this work is maybe making you think differently about research.
Well, I have to run things by an executive board, and it's a very small executive board, but they're typically friendly with each other. 3 members, me, myself, and I. And so sometimes we get into little squabbles. So of course I have a kind of bias towards things that I'm interested in. And that said, it's a fairly wide interest. I'm interested in theater going, I'm interested in acting, I'm interested in textual editing, I'm interested in digital stuff and all kinds of things. But I also really try to make sure that the program is diversified, because if I'm not careful, and by diversity, I mean a lot of different things. I noticed the recent slate has 4 Americans. And of course, Sonia Masai, she's Italian, grew up in Italy. Holger is German. And I try to do that. And I'm trying to make it much more gender and racially diversified, and make sure that we have people, very importantly, not just known name scholars, although it helps actually to, let's face it, at one point I have to ask for some more money. And so the name scholars can bring in perhaps a few more views and make things look a little bit more active. And so I try to go through from, the early career, mid, throughout. I recently spoke with David Sterling Brown, who will soon be at Trinity College in Connecticut. And he's an African-American gentleman, absolutely brilliant, well-spoken, very much being promoted up the ranks because of the exquisite nature of his research, and just a great guy and a great person to talk with. And I want to make sure that we include African-American themes, but this is a global podcast, so I want to make sure we get into Africa and India and into China and areas in the, on the Asian side of America. Mm-hmm. Of course, we've done several Japanese scholars, Shoichi Kawai of the University of Tokyo, who's just a brilliant, brilliant guy all the way through. And I'm having a little bit of trouble getting a few more of those guys, because they're a little shy about, well, this is a problem with anybody who's not a native speaker. It can be a very uncomfortable thing to try to come in and spontaneously speak in English to what's going to be a large body of people who teach and, who have advanced skills. So I try to look over the whole spectrum and to make sure we're entirely inclusive. And so far, so good.
Absolutely. It's such a wonderful series. Thank you for what you're doing on it. And I look forward to the turn to religion that's coming up. So can we talk about your research then? My first encounter with your research was reforming Marlowe. I don't quite know how you think of that first word being pronounced. It's the most glorious study of Marlowe's rediscovery, if that's the right word, in the 18th and 19th centuries, and just how 18th and 19th century Christopher Marlowe is. Our Christopher Marlowe now, perhaps that Christopher Marlowe then. Can you tell us a bit about that book and how that came about for you?
Oh, I hope it's an interesting story, because it was a complete accident. I knew I wanted to write on Marlowe, and all I had really to say about Marlowe is that I'd never read in any of my reading poetry. I was very, very much interested in poetry to begin with, not as much the bibliophile or the textual editor. I got into that because it soon became, at some point, it became necessary and important. But the poetry is what drew me in. And I came across Marlowe. I don't want to age myself too much, but it's, on the heels of some very avant-garde theater that also became not theater, film, that also became avant-garde, like Scorsese was, the younger Scorsese, and the Taxi Driver, the Raging Bull, of course, Coppola's Godfather. I'm in the shadow of these. I could just go on and on naming these films as we go through the 80s and so forth. But I came across Marlowe, and I'd never read poetry that was like that ever. It was so pure that the pentameter, the mighty line, but also the transgressive nature of it, and how delightful some of these horrible themes were made through the structure of the language. It was just, I just sort of fell in love with it. Now, I can't write a 300-page dissertation on how much, on what I just said. That's, everybody agrees. And so I was a little bit, I said, well, I can look into the early publishing history, and did later. And some people, I think, have done that better than I over the past decade or two, maybe. And so I was talking, just like we're talking about now. I was in the office of a guy who had nothing to do with Renaissance drama or early modern drama. He was studying American literature and so forth. And he just kind of said, as a quip, he goes, reception studies are kind of coming back in. It sounds kind of old-fashioned, doing a reception study. And there was this guy, Tucker Brook, who had done a reception study of Marlowe. But
Tom, just to jump in, sorry to interrupt, but just for the benefit of anyone who doesn't know that term, reception studies is the study of the later way in which writers or any creative artist is received, is understood, is rediscovered, is constructed, is represented, is changed. Is that an okay summary? Just someone new to that.
Is reformed, and
it's reformed, and
it's a lot of stuff even in our lives. Now, I'm probably older than a lot of your audience, but when I was kind of teeny bopper, still in school, the Who was still going on, the Stones were still going on, and so forth, and so was a wildly popular band called Uriah Heep that nobody has heard of now. All right. So Led Zeppelin, very big, well, still very big. So I can go to my students and say, have you heard of Led Zeppelin? A lot of them have. All of them have heard of the Beatles. Not many Bob Dylan. Which surprised the hell out of me. And also Uriah Heep, that's a character in Dickens, right? So, so if we go back to the 16th century, when that guy said, okay, reception study and use, some of these critics that were working, primarily Foucault, but Hans Jaus, and there are several famous ones, but it was something that was coming in, and they were doing quite a lot of it at certain other universities. And I thought, well, I'll take a look at this. And back then, I went to the library and thumbed through the MLA bibliography, which is how we did it before we had digital searching technology. And I looked, and there was this gap. There were these plays that came out in the really the early 17th century that in the printing history was more in this short period of time, of records of performance. There are probably many more performances than there are records. And then Marlowe disappears. And really for at least 100 years and 100, you could argue 150 years almost, and is not seen again. And Edmund Malone put together his plays at the Bodleian and just made an edition kind of Marlowe's work, but that didn't have a whole lot of impact. And he appears in a collection by Thomas Warburton in the 18th century, but that was much more of you had to look at what type of book it was, whether it was a subscription book for those who had money, and that doesn't really count. when it really starts counting is when Charles Lamb and others start talking about Marlowe. And the big problem with Marlowe was the biography. That I just looked into this with Lena Cowan Orland, who's looked into Shakespeare's Stratford career, and talks about what she calls evidence clusters. And what happens is one person finds a shred of evidence and makes an assumption, and it's picked up for 100 years or more, right? And Marlowe the atheist, Marlowe the secret agent, spy, Marlowe the bad boy, right, was just not suited for pre-Victorian or Victorian taste, just not a little bit too dodgy. And that has been questioned, it still is being questioned, but the challenge to those Victorians was to try to understand this playwright in terms of their, what we would call romantic. Of course, a lot of them didn't know they were being romantic. They were called that later, right? Which is part of a reception too. But they did have inspired by revolutionary thought, French American Revolution and whatnot. And they gradually moved him into a moral position, Edward Dowden and some great Victorian scholars and so forth. So I was going to write a book about that took up mostly 19th and 20th century Marlowe and bring it up to what then was current. And it was just too unwieldy. I didn't know what to do with it. And I realized really after we got to the Swinburnes and to some of basically the period when Shakespeare and Marlowe and others began being taught in school, that we could leave it off there. And I might come back, for part two, but I couldn't really see much on an ideological scale that changed in the 20th century. He had been canonized and the proper adjustments had been made. So I did a lot of introspection of critics, mostly in the 19th century, and how they worked ideologically with this playwright. And it worked as a kind of litmus test for what happened in terms of the consciousness, the literary mind at that time. So it was kind of dumb luck that I saw that idea. And I was guided by some extraordinarily excellent critical theorists who sort of showed me how to do this. I never met them, I read them, and it just worked out. It clicked. And after that, I went into looking into Shakespearean education and other things. And then I went heavily into having a family and looking for a job and trying to learn how to explain to a Japanese taxi driver how to go straight, left, and right, and start there. And, there were some distractions in there.
That's an important research project in itself, I think, isn't it? Really, it's working out how to get around in a country that's new to you. That's really important.
Well, I can tell you that 3 rights equal 1 left. If you're 1 week in Japan and you learn, okay, I need to make it to the YMCA to give a talk in English because I've been invited, and it's only about 2 kilometers down the road, and it's straight and to the left. And I said, okay, I'm going to memorize straight, masugu, migi, right, hidari, left. And I got in there and flipped out, and I couldn't remember left. And so I said, masugu, and the taxi driver took off. And then I was like, and we passed the left-hand turn. And so I said right, 3 times. I know we're not mathematicians or in geometry, but if you draw it out, you can get back to where you're going if you go right 3 times. So that's one of the stories that I can tell that a little bit better, probably in the pub. But I have a whole spate of stories where I've forgotten the word or mispronounced the word. I had a question with the accounting office about my salary, and I asked them about my dinosaur. It was a fairly easy mistake to make. So yeah, that occupied a good bit of my time, and we didn't when I first came here in the late 90s, we didn't have the digital resources. And it was very, very difficult to do the type of research that I had been doing.
So how did you adapt to that? What I'd quite like to come back to the Christopher Marlowe book, but I also want to pick up on that question, like how you adapt to it. Tom, if it's all right, let's go back to Marlowe, and then we'll come back to that question, because that's fascinating. The sheer kind of mechanics and practicalities of research. But I mean, you were talking in relation to your work on Marlowe that you read wonderful theorists who you never got to meet and speak to directly. But you know, your book was so incredibly important to me when I was doing my PhD, and I have got to meet you and speak with you, and I've been such a beneficiary of you as writer and as human being. So thank you so much. And it was such a useful remapping of how time and culture and ideology and politics work on things which we're often taught to think of as concrete, historical, unchanging things. And so the re-emergence of Marlowe and the politicization and the renegotiation of the various things he seems to stand for biographically. I love that phrase, evidence clusters, the way evidence clusters get stuck and caught in the throats of the people who go on to talk about particular writers. And I'm really struck by what you're saying about how after Swinburne, there isn't necessarily a change in Marlowe's reception. I'm almost wondering if maybe we're just starting to move into a new phase of Marlowe reception. I'm thinking about Pascal Eibischer's work on what the Thomas Middleton edited collection and recent productions of Middleton have done to the way Marlowe is now staged, that Marlowe and Middleton have kind of merged in very peculiar ways. So you get kind of Middletonian productions of Marlowe, whether there's something happening there perhaps. But that book is so glorious and wonderful. So I want to make sure we celebrate it as well as discuss it.
Well, thank you very much. I do feel kind of embarrassed because there was a sort of, what's the word, like lacuna, necessarily, because I was separated from from the major research library for some years in there. So I had to, in trips back, do smaller things and try to contribute that way. But I wouldn't trade it for anything. I mean, I wouldn't want to give up the experience of having moved here and with my family and the friends that I've made and the experiences that I've had. It was a perfect trade-off. So if it costs me the next book or two, then so be it. I would rather have had those experiences, I think. I'd like to have had both. But now, in the past 10 to 15 years, 10 to 15 years, it's getting easier, and I've been able to do both and to enjoy my time here in Tokyo and Japan. Of course, they are very generous about giving us travel money. I'm able to, not recently, of course, but go to the Bodleian, to the Folger, and we met at the Folger. You get everything that you need, and then you can go back and you can find almost everything else. And those dear people that I know at both of those places, if you have a question, there are people there who will answer your question by email. You know, it's usually a small thing. You know, did they open the door of the cathedral on the north side at this time? You know, something that comes up like that. And so I've been able to do, and I still have stuck with, as you know, I've done work with David as just part of his larger team on Lost Plays, which has just been delightful. And these are little small digital publications, but they are revealing, and they've helped me on a couple of, I've put out a few articles about that in the past 10 years. And so I've enjoyed doing that, and also some work on digital humanities in Japan, because I feel that they've saved me. So I'm a little spread out. I've been doing mostly small things, and enjoying the hell out of it, and enjoying being back in the profession and being back in the conversation. But I think that, man, I'm not finished yet, so there might be something else coming.
That's very exciting to hear. I think probably we should start to move towards wrapping up now, and I'm wondering if we might cycle back, as I suggested, to the fact that you've been teaching Shakespeare and the English Bible in a Japanese context, and you've been doing that whilst also moving towards running this series, which is itself turning towards religion. So do you mind telling us a little bit more about that nexus for you of Shakespeare, Bible, and where you're going next with Speaking of Shakespeare?
Well, one way I responded to the lack of resources to do heavy bibliographical text, heavy archival work is that I wrote a book entitled Shakespeare. I'm sorry, Shakespeare. Genesis in Japan, which came out in 2014 with the Texas A&M Press, and there's not a footnote in it. I just talked about my experiences teaching Japanese students the Bible, and it was a tabula. I'm using the students in a way as a sort of tabula rasa. What do you do when someone has not been preconditioned to have any kind of real response to the Bible? Most of them probably came to class thinking, oh, this is the nice book where everybody's very Christian to each other and they forgive, and it's wonderful. And we start out, and it's God destroys the world, and then it's murder, murder, war, murder, 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 murder. And I had these adult students at the front of the class one year looking at me, and they had tea ceremony practice, I think, or they were doing that. They had kimonos on, and they were looking at me, and their faces, which after about 5 weeks, just started falling. Like, when are we going to get to the happy part? And then we get to the happy part, and this guy gets nailed to a piece of wood, and and then these other guys get killed. So there's a lot of unhappiness in that part too. But I did not teach it as a way to convert or entirely as a secular text. And I said, here is just a major work in Western culture, and take from it what you want. We have a minister on campus who teaches Christianity, and so I didn't. I don't mess with that, and it's been kind of a joy. So during that time, I've had to learn the Bible myself. The course was thrown on me because what my colleague said, I was, she was. Well, she wasn't retiring. Another guy who was teaching it was retiring. She taught Milton, and she knew the course was coming to her, and she didn't want to do it because it's big. The Bible's big. And she came to me, and she was my senior colleague at this time, 20 years ago. And she says, "You're from the American South, right?" And I said, "Yeah, I am." So that means that you understand something about Christianity. I said, "Well, we all went to church when I was a kid." She said, "And you teach Shakespeare, so the language of the King James Version shouldn't be that hard for you." And I said, "No." He said, "Okay, it's your class." So it landed on me. And then I started seeing the connections. I began becoming very interested in Reformation theology, again, from a distance, not as, and that drew me into a strong interest into the environment at St. Paul's Cathedral. During the 16th century and during the Elizabethan settlement period, and this one preaching pulpit on the northeast side that is a sort of theater in its own way, if you like sermons, surrounded by bookstores that were established, I think, through a couple of decades to promote religious learning. And they found out that they could sell translations of Ovid, translations of, Thomas and Norris, this and that, basically works that we all know are source texts for Shakespeare and other playwrights at the time. And there it was, this kind of echo chamber there and in the nave. So that's what I've been working on for 10 years. And maybe I might get it formed into a book here, but that's what I hope will happen. So that's the connection I'm making, I guess, from Bible, how it's again reception, how God is reshaped in terms of worship, and how that somehow, as an accidental outcome, helped to fuel the theater of this time that we're so interested in.
Yeah, and you're describing it as a kind of theatre, and you said if you like sermons, and people did. I mean, it's a kind of mass media, sometimes going on for more than an hour. Sometimes given to 5,000 to 6,000 people at a time, which is 2 to 3 times the size of the largest theatres we know in the period, and often delivered in a deeply theatrical way, and in a very theatrical context to a large, bustling, thriving crowd of people moving in and out of that crowd. And yet at the same time, they're in competition with the theatres. So they sit in such an interesting space in relationship to this other kind of art form we're used to thinking of in this period.
Yes. and this, yeah, it's not as interesting to us, but they were going through a cosmic shift. I mean, you're getting rid of purgatory, other things too, but just purgatory, how you thought about your deceased relatives and where they were in the cosmos, and how you dealt with death. And we all know that they tore down the charnel house and moved the bones of the dead out to the Shoreditch somewhere. And they're basically saying, nope, no more purgatory. So that would have much more dramatic, impact. And I see it, when I started looking at it, I see it all over Shakespeare. You see it in Hamlet, just at the places where we think Hamlet's really slowing down. You're thinking, no, this audience, this is big stuff. Even when he says heaven and earth, it's bringing into mind, and the globe, as opposed to the old cosmology that everybody knew wasn't really the case, but they still worshipped in that way of the top, middle, and bottom. Hell's beneath you, purgatory's in between, heaven's up there, and so just the metaphysics of the whole thing, I think, would have made these, and also the fact that these guys, when they fell out of favor, it didn't end well for them, right? You have the famous Oxford martyrs not long before Elizabeth. So these are dramatic. So, and John Fox very famously with all of those horror stories and so forth. Yeah.
Metaphysics and physics is a kind of DIY. Internal redecoration, a kind of feng shui rethinking of the afterlife, both at the level of religious spaces on the planet and the religious spaces in your head and the way you imagine the afterlife. Absolutely extraordinary. Tom, I can't wait for your series, Speaking of Shakespeare, to turn to these incredibly exciting, fascinating matters. And there has been, I think, a number of times in the last 20 years, people have talked about a kind of religious turn in scholarship, but I'm not sure we've had a huge religious turn in public scholarship around Shakespeare, perhaps. So I'll be excited to see if that's where your series drives us. Tom, we end our conversations by asking what the word literature means to you. You're welcome to answer this in as personal or as professional a way as you like. But yeah, where does the word literature sit in your vocabulary?
Well, with my training that some people think is a cynical training about literature, heavy on Foucault, or early on, heavy on some other scholars, who, talk about various things. But I always loved literature. But I remember Terry Eagleton in the book, I'm not sure the title now, something like a guide to literary criticism or something, but he concludes very early on that some works are born literary, some achieve literariness, and some have literariness thrust upon them. So that's where I am, right? At what point do we become literary? So my response to literature is look at those early quartos of Shakespeare's plays and how little value they had, right? And I remember albums, and I think back and I'm going, wow, if I had some kind of prophetic vision, that Rolling Stones album with the zipper on the front, man, if I'd have bought 20 of those, and now what would they be worth? Okay. So somewhere along the way, these bad boys that, all the adults of just thought, oh, this is just trash. Now they're iconic and have been for a long, long time. So, those are cases of achieving it or having it thrust upon them. There have been some, I've seen movies that, and I'm putting all forms of media into a potentially literary category. Poetry and the great poets, in America, we seem to just kind of end with Robert Frost in terms of the great public poet. And Larkin in England, Seamus Heaney in Ireland. You don't. It thins out after these great names. But what happened then is that the music took over, and poetry is originally musical, a sung form. So it's just natural that we would get away from the podium and bang on the guitar and come out with it in a spate. There's hundreds of songs that are beautiful and are poetic, and as far as I'm concerned, literary, right? But I have, there are certain singers that have been thrust to the top. There are certain movies that are immediately accepted by all of the right critics as being, this is going to be the next great artistic statement. And for instance, Woody Allen was big when I was young, and all of the pretentious coffee club types that I hung out with. I fell in with a bad crowd. Yes, it's Woody Allen. And I kept thinking, I'm not going to tell my friends here how much I like Clint Eastwood revenge movies. I just love revenge movies. And then a few years after that, I'm here we are in Jacobean drama. And there, the revenge motif, well, Spanish tragedy, and it just drove the whole thing. And who do we know now? Is Clint Eastwood. And if I asked my students about Woody Allen, I don't think they would know. But he was the artistic guy, the literary guy. Clint Eastwood, popular, kind of almost kitsch, right? So, and again, I'm going into that reception thing. Why Eastwood and not Allen? And so I can just say that not only me, but people who are not in the profession that we're in, sometimes we damage things that could be enjoyed more and mean more because we are trained to analyze these kinds of things. And literary study, whether you have it everywhere, all over the place. You have it in Enid, Oklahoma, when a young woman and her friend go out to see a movie and talk about it afterwards. As far as I'm concerned, that's just as literary as anything else. And what we hope as teachers and as scholars is we can help for preservation, for understanding, and also maybe open up a few doors. I gave up a long time ago with 100% of my students, walking through that door with me, because there is a sort of dawning that occurs where you just go, oh, now I get it. And I've never found a way to create, to be biblical and just say, boom, here it is, convert. But some do, and it's always a joy when that happens. And before we get off, too, I do want to say that if anyone trusts my critical judgments, Joel Cohen's Macbeth is not to be missed. It is not. It would almost be sinful, no matter what branch of literature that you're in. It is absolutely brilliant. It's not, as one critic said, it's not really Macbeth for beginners. You kind of want to know the play a bit before you get into what he's doing. But that's another just great example. You can take a director who did The Great Lebowski, and he goes in and both of them, as far as I'm concerned, are on equal footing in terms of their literary value and their what is it? The way they have sustained themselves through generations in terms of works of art.
What an amazing reply, Tom. Thank you. And you said at one point that literature and particularly poetry is a kind of musical form. And I'm just so delighted that the embarrassed trumpet player Little Boy Blue went on to become the YouTube star that he is today. Thank you so much for all of the conversations you shared, the generosity you've brought to us all in driving these conversations. And I really look forward to seeing what happens with Speaking of Shakespeare and Thomas Tabbs in the future. Thank you.
Andy, the pleasure is mine. And thank you and your audience so much. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye-bye.